it's pretty obvious that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez has had a disproportionate part of the spotlight since she was elected last November. But the fact is that she does certain things that inevitably put her closer to the glare of the cameras as well as, the thumbs of all these tweeters. So when she came out with this interview today with Michael Isaacoff, who is a former Newsweek and Washington Post reporter now working for Yahoo, which I believe has become kind of a dustbin of former top flight journalists. I think that it would be reasonable to assume that she would say some things that would become embarrassments. So there were two things that really stood out. One of them having to do with impeachment, and the other having to do with foreign policy with Israel. So I think I'll go with the impeachment first.
Customs and Border Protection, that he would pardon him if he faced jail for denying entry to migrants. Chairman Jerry Nadler of the House Judiciary Committee said today that this showed the president's contempt for the law, and that it was for the president to suggest that goal by deliberately seeking to break the law is unforgivable. I assume you agree with him. The question is, what should...
So that report, I haven't seen confirmation of it, but there are some sources that are claiming that Donald Trump apparently guaranteed a pardon for the head of Customs and Border Patrol if he would deny entry to migrants. So now, if that is true, I guess that would be kind of hilarious. But the fact is that until he does something that's actually illegal, then really, what are you going to impeach him for? But she goes into it, and it becomes quite confusing.
Be the consequences.
I mean, I think this is largely a question for our leadership. I think this is a very grave problem, but there are so many aspects to this presidency that have posed a grave problem.
Is it impeachable in your view?
I think you could reach in a bag and pull so many things out that are impeachable of this president.
So then they go into some of the things that Ocasio-Cortez finds that are impeachable.
For impeaching this president.
Well, your colleague, Congresswoman Tlaib, she's introduced a resolution to impeach. Have you signed on? Are you signing on?
We hadn't signed on when it was first introduced, but we probably will. We'll take a look into it.
You think you will?
Yeah. There's just so many things.
Well, what would be your top three? If you were drafting the articles of impeachment for the president, what would be Article 1, 2, and 3?
Well, I think number one is emoluments. I think it's always been emoluments. I think it's always been about that for me. Mm-hmm.
So she says, well, I think it's always been about emoluments for me. And what is emoluments? It's essentially receiving favors from foreign governments.
2 and 3?
2 and 3. I think 2 would be tax fraud. Mm-hmm. And number 3, number 3, if there's an investigation on this, I think this is pretty potent.
Interesting that you don't mention.
So she doesn't even get to number 3. This really reminds me of 2012 when Rick Perry was a candidate in the Republican primary for president. And he said that there were 3 departments that you could eliminate, and he couldn't think of the third one. I think he was trying to think of the Department of Energy, which nowadays he's actually the head of. So some people would say, well, Rick Perry, he was a governor for so many years, and then he should have been able to remember this. AOC is a brand new person. No, that's not an excuse, because what we're talking about isn't a future campaign policy. it is something where you're trying to execute basically a judicial process through the legislature. Impeachment means that you essentially bring up the question of removing a president from office. You're bringing the question up. You're basically accusing somebody. So she doesn't know what she's accusing the president of, even though she said you could reach into a whole bag of different reasons. She could only think of two of them. Okay, and the third one she couldn't think of at all. The first one, emoluments, she didn't really elaborate on. And the second one, tax fraud, she couldn't throw out a specific instance of Donald Trump committing tax fraud. Now, let me tell you, if it was the case where Donald Trump was committing tax fraud, they would have to have the IRS press charges against him, and probably that would be the basis of removing him from office. But that hasn't happened yet. And him releasing his tax returns, think about it. They want him to release his tax returns. What would the tax returns reveal, do you think? Would it reveal that Donald Trump has this massive pattern of committing tax fraud? I mean, who would put that on his actual tax return? Only a complete and utter moron who would probably be busted inside of 10 minutes by the IRS would do that. And that hasn't happened with Donald Trump. What has he bribed the IRS? Has the IRS just been, covering for Donald Trump since he started in business? Even under Obama, was the IRS covering for Donald Trump? So the entire premise of her argument that tax fraud would be the second reason just doesn't have anything to back it up. And those of you that are going to say, well, he was using all of these corporate loopholes and bankruptcies and hiding his wealth and stuff like that and putting stuff on offshore banks. Loopholes and different tax havens and shelters, yes, you might have a problem with that. That might not be comporting with your worldview. Obviously, I think that you have a problem with that, and you have a right to have a problem with that type of thing. That's not a crime. You can't impeach somebody for doing things that are legal, even if they're things that are what one would consider unethical.
In Russia in the top three.
No, I don't. Because I think that for a lot of aspects of the Russia investigation, as we saw with the Mueller report, is that I think there are a lot of parts to the Russia issue that comes down to emoluments. It comes down to pay for play, financial transactions, Trump Tower. It comes down to money, and if we had gotten something from the Mueller report, then I would probably put that up there as number one. But I feel like it's a little risky to put the entire grounds of impeachment, put all your eggs in that basket. And when I think that a lot of this stuff happens through backdoor bank accounts and things like that. So I think emoluments kind of includes any misconduct, financial misconduct in relation to Russia.
And specifically on tax fraud, what do you have in mind? Is there something specific like the deflating assets to the insurance issue, those issues that you brought up, I think, in when you were questioning Michael Cohen? Yeah,
I agree. I think it comes to that. I mean, there's just so much.
Okay, let me ask you.
Like the census. There's.
Right.
Yeah, she's saying that there's so much, but she points to Michael Cohen, who couldn't supply any documents that proved that Donald Trump was committing any fraud. He couldn't show that he was doing anything that was illegal. In fact, Michael Cohen did more to incriminate himself during that testimony than he did to incriminate Donald Trump. And this is really where you see the lack of real appreciation for what evidence means for Ocasio-Cortez. She doesn't say that she's going to exclude Russia from the impeachment proceedings because there's no proof of collusion. Okay, she says that, well, really that fits under the emoluments clause. Well, if it fits under the emoluments clause and you're saying that Donald Trump received gifts from foreign leaders, then you're saying that possibly the Mueller investigation should have turned up evidence that Donald Trump was receiving gifts, right? Do you think that? By the way, upon entering office, the Trump administration would probably have been screened by the Secret Service to see a lot of these connections to foreign governments. Actually, I think the FBI does that. So the FBI runs an investigation anyway on Trump administration appointees and people that are part of the staff in order to see if they are connected to Russia, okay, or to other countries. It doesn't have to be Russia; it could be any other country. So in the past 2 years, there hasn't been a shred of evidence that has come up that actually substantiates any of the allegations of emoluments or anything. It's literally been they've had all the time in the world to try to prove it, and they don't have any evidence of it. And actually, Michael Isikoff, who's one of the people, he's the guy under the cursor right over here. He is one of the biggest purveyors of the whole Russia conspiracy hoax. He was working hand in hand with David Corn of Mother Jones on it, and he's backed off a bit, but he's never fully apologized for his role in moving forward the Steele dossier as a theory as to the Trump-Russia collusion. And now he's sitting across the table from AOC and trying to get her to buy into a theory that nobody's proven. And instead of saying, well, actually, I can't prove any of it, and therefore I'm not going to include it in my case, she's lending credence to his ridiculous views.
You know, I can't even, the tax bill, it's like, there's just so much.
So notice those are the last two things that she mentions. Trump's idea that you should be able to determine if somebody's a citizen through the census. So counting the census according to citizenship, she thinks that's an impeachable offense. Okay, that's something that's in the court right now. First of all, whether it has foundation, and it's very likely, I believe, that Trump will win in the Supreme Court. And then the tax bill. So she's saying that pushing through a piece of legislation through the House and the Senate, which passed both the House and the Senate and was signed by the president, like every other bill in the country, and which is constitutional because there have been tax cuts in the past. She's saying that that's grounds for impeachment. Does this woman know anything about what impeachment means, what you're supposed to impeach people for? So here she is talking about Israel and some and the military aid to Israel.
I have one more foreign policy question for you that's quite current right now. Prime Minister Netanyahu was just apparently reelected in Israel right after saying that he intended to annex the Jewish settlements on the West Bank. Do you believe this should affect U.S. policy to the state of Israel?
I think so.
How so?
Well, I think these are part of conversations that we're having in our caucus, but I think what we're really seeing is the ascent of authoritarianism across the world. I think that Netanyahu is a Trump-like figure, and I think that
Okay, so in case she hasn't noticed, this is something I said last week several times. Netanyahu has been in office for 10 years. It's not the ascent of authoritarian figures because he's been reelected 5 times. He's been reelected by vote, and he's formed coalitions. But hear the rest of her argument here.
There are so many ways to approach this issue. Betty McCollum even has a proposal that she's advanced, asking the U.S. not to fund child detention in Israel, Israeli child detention of Palestinian children. You know, there's different ways to signal it. You know, I would hope and wish that a diplomatic approach could change some and impact policy. It doesn't all have to be legislative, but I think if we just sit on our hands.
Well, should we?
Would you be in favor of reducing military or economic aid to Israel?
I mean, I think it's on the table. I think it's certainly on the table, and I think it's something that can be discussed. And I think that and I also acknowledge my role in this as well, in that I think that that I hope to play a facilitating role in this conversation and a supportive role in this conversation. But I also know that there are people that have been leading on this for a long time, like Congresswoman McCollum. Mm-hmm. And so I think it's important to, but I think that we need to expand what those policy conversations are, because I would, as just a citizen of this country, I would be very concerned if Trump started really pursuing more and more and more increasingly dangerous policies, and everyone just standing aside and say this is normal, this is just like.
So yeah, that's an interesting take on her part, and it's not as inflammatory as some of her other statements. But let's think about what she's using as a basis for reducing military aid over there. The fact is that Benjamin Netanyahu, love him or hate him, I personally, I don't really like him. But what are Democrats really complaining about lately? They're complaining about the popular vote, complaining about the fact that the president is not elected directly. You have to go through the electoral college, and that it's a vestige of slavery. Guess who's a democratically elected leader by popular vote? Benjamin Netanyahu. Guess how he forms his government? By forming coalitions with other parties within the Israeli parliament, the Knesset. So what she's essentially doing is she's punishing democracy over there. She's punishing the will of the Israeli voter. Now, yes, there are issues of annexing the West Bank, or parts of the West Bank is really what they're talking about, Israeli settlement blocks, which, if you want to talk about how that shouldn't be done unilaterally and that should come out of financial aid to Israel, I think that you could make a case for it. But the fact is that Ocasio-Cortez, if you would ask her what her broader vision of American foreign policy would be, she wouldn't be able to get into specifics. If Israel were not to be a U.S. ally in the Middle East, okay, let's go down that road for a second. Who would be the main U.S. ally there? A lot of the progressives do not trust Saudi Arabia, understandably. How about Egypt? They're also generally disdained by progressives for a lot of their authoritarian tendencies. And then with regards to Syria, there's a division on the progressive side. Some people believe that Assad is a force for stability. Some people look at him as a war criminal. Then you look at Iran. Iran, if you were to, where do you go and say that the U.S. should be an ally of this country or a different one? They don't want to talk about it. They only want to talk about the issue of Israel and Palestine without looking at the region in general, which, by the way, is the problem with conservatives, too. The conservatives only want to talk about the need for a strong relationship with Israel without discussing other aspects of our relations with countries like Jordan, Egypt, and, of course, some of the Russian supporting countries over there like Syria and Iran. Now, I think that it's better for the U.S. to have a strong relationship with Israel. I think that Israel plays a good role in facilitating and mediating between us and other countries, including Russia, by the way, which last week Al Jazeera ran a hilarious piece considering that a conspiracy. So, yes, I think that Ocasio-Cortez, when you put her across the table from a reporter and you get her to answer real questions about policy, it really shines a light on how empty her whole perspective of the world is. She thinks that you can just impeach somebody because you suspect them of tax fraud without actually having any evidence of it. You think that you can roll all this Russian collusion mess into the emoluments clause, which, again, you would think that they would find proof of through the FBI, even beyond the Mueller investigation. And then when it comes to Israel, she starts to say, well, reducing foreign aid should be on the table as a result of a democratic election. So that's about it. Please like, share, and subscribe. Let me know what you think of Ocasio-Cortez's take on both of these topics or other topics, maybe from this podcast, in the comments below. And also subscribe to me on BitChute, which is @Chef Leopard on BitChute. On Minds.com, it's also @Chef Leopard. And on Gab, it's at Starscream85. And have a wonderful Tuesday. I will see you later.